We're back with the next set of Dino DPS testing, and this time we're focusing on the herbivore side of things. But before you think herbivores, they can't do damage, I have to warn you, we have some really strange results in this video, so stick around to see them all. This is part 2 of the video series, so I implore you to watch the first one if you want to understand the methodology and how and why we're doing it in this specific way, and I'll link that for you in the description. Normally I like making my videos as watchable on their own as possible, but for the sake of your time, it's probably best that I don't repeat myself too much as we have a lot of stuff to cover. So, to be specific, this video will include all the land herbivores that you'll find on the island that are rideable, which means that non-rideable creatures, sea creatures, and flying creatures will all feature in future videos, along with videos from the subsequent DLC maps. Either way, let's get cracking. Starting with the ugly pig elephant, the Thymomia, and just as a disclaimer, I'm going to butcher all the names of these dinosaurs or creatures, so fair warning. But the Thymomia is what you would expect for a dinosaur, with its saddle unlocked at level 5. The Thymomia is much beloved as a poop machine, but honestly that's all it's good for. Its DPS is a paltry 21, and to top it off, it's also unable to attack while moving. 21 DPS puts the Piggyphant at a shockingly 3rd worst overall, which is shocking not because it's bad, but because it means that there are 2 creatures on this list that are worse than the Thymomia. Moving on to something not worse than the Thymomia, the Moschops is amazing. It's not got a saddle, and it's normally found on beaches and other easy places for you to spawn your character. And on top of that, some of the Moschops require very easily gatherable stuff to tame. So you could very easily have a Moschops pet within the first 30 seconds of the game if you know what you're doing. And for a creature so easily tameable, its DPS is astounding. It has a DPS of 81, which is stellar. It eclipses most creatures that you'll be able to tame for quite a while, but it does come with some caveats. It's great at damage if you're riding it, but if you're not riding it, it will always flee from fights, which makes the Moschops a very bad bodyguard. And on top of that, it's pretty slow at running around, so riding it can be a little annoying. Overall, it's technically a great dinosaur, and it is a good one, but it's not quite as good as the 81 DPS without a level requirement would have you believe. The next obtainable saddle by level is one of the most iconic dinosaurs in Ark, the Parasaur. Despite being so iconic to Ark, the Parasaur is known for its great ability to detect predators rather than its ability to fend them off. The Parasaur has a DPS of 25, which, yeah, it's nothing special, but for what it's worth, the Parasaur is better than the worst carnivore, the Carbonomes, and the Parasaur also has an often overlooked C-button ability to scare off some of the smaller predators, allowing you to just avoid the fight completely. Next up is the Pachycephalosaurus. This little fella is in an odd spot. It's got a DPS of 21, which means that it's worse at dealing damage compared to a Parasaur, and yet somehow that's a good thing. So, the Pachycephalosaurus's one role is an early game torpor inducer. The Pachycephalosaur's attacks will do 1.7 times the damage as torpor damage, which on its own isn't overwhelmingly practical because most dinosaurs will die to the damage before getting knocked out by the extra torpor damage that you're dealing. But by using its right-click attack, you can charge, and that attack will deal 5.95 times the torpor damage, making it a much more effective early game knockout dinosaur, saving you lots and lots of narcotics. Not to mention that this really early game is normally when narcotics are most difficult to get. Overall, it's not got great DPS, but that's fine for its role in the game. Next up is a dinosaur that needs no introduction, the Triceratops. And despite its saddle being unlocked at level 16, the trike absolutely lives up to its fame as a dinosaur. It punches well above its weight, and its DPS can put a lot of other dinosaurs to shame with a whopping 78 DPS, on top of being quite a tanky dude as well. Great in a fight. At 78 DPS, that means that even when compared to the Raptor, the carnivore's equivalent to an early game sort of tame around the trike's level, the trike utterly dominates, being almost double its DPS. In fact, its DPS is so high that it's better than some of the mid-game dinosaurs like the Carnotaur or the Baryonyx. However, there is a bit of a caveat that we need to address in regards to this DPS. The trike's attacks have some incredible knockback, and that's great as it keeps dangerous dinosaurs away from you and prevents you from taking damage. But that also means that if you want to reach the very, very good 78 DPS of the Triceratops, you need to pin your enemy against a rock or something else to prevent them getting knocked back. Otherwise, the dinosaur will be miles away, and sure, you'll be able to attack very quickly afterwards, but you won't be able to hit the enemy. The Triceratops also suffers a little bit from poor movement speed, which might make it a less appealing choice as a mount, but on the whole, it's a great dinosaur and it's highly overlooked for what it's actually capable of. After that bombshell, we have the Equus, and I have a real love-hate relationship with the Equus. For all intents and purposes, it's a better Pachycephalosaurus, although technically the Equus is more likely to kill things. But me using the Equus while trying to tame dinosaurs has gotten me into sticky situations far more often than I would like. It has a DPS of 29 while headbutting things, and a DPS of 31 when kicking. But be aware that the kicks are very stamina consumptive and can leave your horse unconscious almost as often as they leave your creature that you're trying to knock out with the kicks. I'll quickly mention that the unicorn is technically just an Equus. It's just a model slot. The only real difference is that the unicorn is absurdly rare to find, and that makes it a fun trophy tame. Next up is the Megaroo, the Procoptodon, its saddle being unlocked at level 23, making it the one level higher than the Pulmonoscorpius from the Carnivores video. And compared to the Mega Scorpion, the Mega Kangaroo hits for significantly less, with a DPS of 39 compared to the Scorpion's 47. And of course, the Scorpion was already performing worse than average because it was trying to do knockout damage, a bit like the Equus. However, one of the main caveats with the Kangaroo is that consistently hitting the training dummy with its back kick is very difficult. So there is a very, very low chance that the Procoptodon could hit harder than the 39 that is listed here. But doing some quick maths, I'm pretty confident that kicking DPS is lower than the biting DPS, and that means that it would never be as high as 39 anyway. But not all is lost, as the Procoptodon's purpose is clearly that of a scout, and with its great ability to jump and its fast movement speed, it can get out of sticky situations very nicely. So it's a great creature to have, but as we're focusing on DPS, it's not a winner in this video. The next dinosaur is one of the real A-listed dinosaurs, along the likes of the T-Rex and the Triceratops. And similarly to the others, it's got special treatment of sorts. The Stegosaurus is a really odd dinosaur. Currently, it does a DPS of 44, which is probably pretty fair for the level that its saddle is unlocked. That 44 DPS is being stunted, however, by what I can only describe as a bug. If you click as fast as you can with the Stegosaur, it can sort of attack with its tail quite fast, but a lot of the attacks will just not register as hits for whatever reason. I can only assume that this is a bug, and that the animation of the subsequent attacks are not activating like the damage hitbox for some reason. So you have to click slowly and let the animation fully end to actually get any sort of consistent damage off. And in that case, it gets stunted at 44. If this didn't happen, the DPS could possibly be stronger than even the Triceratops' DPS at the moment. However, it's not the case, so we're going to have to sit at 44. But overall, it's probably worth remembering that the Stego is designed to be a bullet sponge, so the somewhat respectable damage that it has is already really good, given that it's not really supposed to be a damage dealer anyway. Unfortunately, the herbivore strangeness doesn't stop, as the next dinosaur, the Pachyrhinoceros, I don't know about that one, is really weird. If you attack as fast as you possibly can, the animation skips, adding damage hitbox, and the DPS is pretty low. But if you time it right, the Pachyrhino reaches a ludicrous 88 DPS as you're clicking in the rhythm. Now that's really crazy. Like really, really strong for a dinosaur whose saddle is unlocked at level 27. However, it's not all sunshine and roses, as the Pachyrhino normally deals knockback just like the Triceratops. So it's not likely to reach 88 DPS without forethought to pin your target and prevent them from getting knocked back by your own attacks. Next up, we've got the Gallimimus. And the Gallimimus is the epitome of a scout dinosaur. It's a speedy boy, and it can speed around, but don't expect it to fight back. It's not got a good damage output, and its DPS is 20, making it part of the exclusive club of dinosaurs that are out DPS'd by a Thermomia. Yeah, it's not great. Let's move on. On the other hand, the Iguanodon is pretty good. There's no funny business going on with the DPS or caveats to add about having to time attacks perfectly or to position your enemy to prevent your attacks doing knockback and preventing you from actually being able to hit them. No, the Iguanodon is a simple dinosaur, but it also lives up to the community moniker of a rich man's parasol. Clocking in at 61 DPS, it's comfortably above average for its saddle level, which is 30, as at 61, it's much closer to dinosaurs like the Carnotaur, the Baryonyx, and the Daeodon, rather than dinosaurs around its saddle level like the Pterodon. The Gallimimus is the epitome of a scout dinosaur. It's a speedy boy that speeds around, and it'll get you to where you need to go really, really quickly. But don't expect it to be able to fight back if you get caught along the way. It's not got a great damage output with a DPS of 20, making it part of the exclusive club of dinosaurs that are out DPS'd by the Thermomia. Yeah, it's not great. The Iguanodon, on the other hand, is pretty good. There's no funny business going on with the DPS. There's no caveats about having to time the attacks perfectly or positioning your enemy to prevent your attacks from doing knockback. No, the Iguanodon is a simple creature, and it really lives up to its community moniker of a rich man's parasol. It clocks in at 61 DPS, so that's comfortably above average for the saddles that you'd get around level 30, as at 61, it's much closer to dinosaurs like the Carnotaur and the Baryonyx and the Daeodon, rather than dinosaurs that are around its saddle level, like the Terrorbird. The Megaloceros shares its saddle level with the Iguanodon at level 30, which makes for a rather interesting comparison between the two. However, the Megaloceros does come with more caveats compared to the Iguanodon, which may make things a little bit more complicated. The main problem for the Megaloceros is that the female Megaloceros doesn't have antlers and therefore can't attack. So, unless you're using them to breed for more deer, or you're using them to mate boost the male deer that you're riding on, the females are unfortunately not very useful in this comparison. But it's worth mentioning that they do have their own unique bonus. They are 25% faster than the male deer, so they're not as completely useless as some people would have you believe. But as we're focusing on damage, let's look at the male deer. Their DPS is slightly higher than the iguanodon, which was already in a pretty good spot. The Megaloceros clocks in at 63 DPS, but it gets better than that because of the Megaloceros is also able to deal bleed damage. However, it's a really unique bleed effect in that it only works on player characters, and because deer won't fight back in the wild, you're not going to see it unless you're attacking on the deer in PvP. But in that situation, the Megaloceros gets a further damage boost, making it a great scouting mount, but also meaning that it's able to dabble in light skirmishes if one arises. Now here is for a serious shocker that completely breaks all notions of understanding. The mammoth is amazing, and its DPS is absurdly high, clocking in at a peak DPS of 134, which puts the mammoth at the top of the vegetarians in terms of DPS. And yes, that makes it stronger and better at dealing damage, to be specific, than the Therizinosaur. Now, that might be surprising, and yeah, the mammoth has a lot of caveats to get to that point. Firstly, its attack is dependent on where the camera is pointed, and some directions are better than others. The key thing you want is your mammoth to headbutt forward and to not swing his head from side to side. If your mammoth is swinging his head side to side, it's a big DPS loss. And the more it swings, the more DPS you're going to lose. But unfortunately, the problems don't stop here. You've also got to factor in the knockback, which would reduce the amount of DPS that the mammoth has in a real situation. And you've also got to factor in the amount of stamina drain that the attacks do. The mammoth's stamina drain per attack seems to be balanced around the longer attack animation of the head swipe. So when you're only headbutting, you burn through your stamina really quick. So realistically, the mammoth can do some crazy DPS, but it's also very tricky to pull it off. Realistically then, when that setup isn't happening, you could probably talk about 88 DPS if a monster's locked against a wall, and using that as a baseline, that's still a really good value. That's a really good dinosaur, especially for a dinosaur or I guess a prehistoric creature with a saddle at level 32, on top of the fact that the mammoth also has amazing wood gathering capabilities and an ability to debuff enemies. So it's a very good creature to tame. The Diplodocus, on the other hand, is not. I wanted to mention it for completion's sake, but the Diplodocus cannot attack, so effectively he's a non-scorer. Moving on to the actual next creature on the list, the living bowling ball. The Doedicurus itself is a dinosaur about utility. It gathers stone for you, and that's about it. But for its level, its damage is... it's fine. It's got 44 DPS, and 40 seems to be the ballpark for utility dinosaurs. And considering that the bowling ball saddle is unlocked at 34, that's actually pretty reasonable for where it is. But then again, you've also got to consider that there are dinosaurs that you have access to at level 34 that are not reasonable. They are much stronger than average. And so, yeah, it's fine, but there are also better options. If stone is to Doedicurus, then metal is to the Ankylosaurus. And the Ankylosaurus, brilliant dinosaur by the way, is also brilliant in terms of DPS, rocking in at 101. The Anky hits really, really well. And it's not surprising, as you can sort of just leave Ankylosaurs up near metal deposits, and unless they get really, really, really unlucky, they will happily fend for themselves and not have any sort of issues until you show up again. However, once again, and unfortunately it is becoming a bit of a trend, Ankylosaurs have a chunky amount of knockback with their attacks, which makes their DPS less than shown. The Parasa, notable for having a saddle that you can build on at level 50, but also available earlier with a saddle that you can't build on at level 41. Even at the higher level of 50, the Parasa has got a very respectable DPS for its saddle level equivalent at 95. However, we've all heard the story before, herbivores and their bloody knockback. is going to make the DPS of the Parasaur look higher than it really is. So 95 isn't quite what you'd expect in the field. It would be much closer to about 45. Thankfully, the next dinosaur isn't going to have this issue. So apparently, it's a scientifically known fact that the Chalicotherium love to drink beer, and where beer goes, fighting normally follows. Firstly, Chalicotheriums are really interesting beasts, as they have a turret mode that allows them to act as bodyguards for your base by just throwing rocks at things. But more importantly, you can also make them throw rocks while you're riding them. And that's great as a ranged attack, especially because most dinosaurs don't get ranged attacks. However, Fisticuffs is still where the better DPS is. And that DPS is 76, which is great. That's in the ballpark for mid-tier monsters, like the Carnotaur and the Baryonyx, while also having a saddle that is 10 levels lower than most of that mid-tier pack. However, one thing to mention is that getting beers in Ark is a bit of a waiting game. So in all honesty, you might long surpass the need to have a DPS dino of the Chalicotherium's sort of tier by the time you've actually acquired the beer to tame the darn thing. Still got the rock throwing niche though, so that's good. On the other hand, Megatheriums, the Mega Sloths, are already well known by most people to be great killer creatures. And with a DPS of 78, that's not surprising, or maybe it is a little surprising. It's essentially a more tanky Baryonyx in terms of DPS, which is good, but not overtly stellar. However, the Megatherium really begins to shine when dealing with insects, as it gains a passive 150 damage buff, which in theory makes the DPS jump right up to 117, which is very nice. But on top of that, once it's killed an insect, it gains another buff, the insect killer buff, which is a 250% increase to damage, which on its own would make the DPS 195. And if you're fighting more insects after you've killed the first one, both the buffs stack, becoming a 375% buff for a total of 292 DPS, which is terrifyingly strong and by far the strongest thing we've covered yet, but only in a specific situation. The woolly rhino is quite a difficult dinosaur, prehistoric creature to give a reading for because of its unique charge gimmick. If we just look at the woolly rhinos doing damage while standing still, it's got a very respectable DPS of 84, and that alone is brilliant for its level, 53. If we think of it as a mid-tier creature like the Baryonyx and the Carnotaurus, the woolly rhino trades speed for above average damage and for health. However, the woolly rhino also gets a unique charge buff. Basically, while you're sprinting on a rhino, a small heart icon on the right of the screen will fill up. And the more it's filled up, the more damage the attacks the woolly rhino will deal. Fully maxing it out increases a single hit from 70 to 630, which is crazy. And hypothetically, if you don't stop sprinting, you can keep attacking at this level. And if you were to do that, you'd have a DPS of 756, which is utterly bonkers, but also unfortunately unrealistic. And this is because sprinting with the rhino while attacking and somehow not getting interrupted is incredibly difficult to do. However, you shouldn't underestimate the charge attacks either, as if you're able to charge in, attack, circle around, and then charge in again, you can still get a very, very respectable DPS. However, getting a fair number for this is also very difficult because the woolly rhino has trample damage, and that causes issues with the training. If I were to estimate, I'd reckon the charging DPS would sit around 100 to 130 DPS, with the possibility of it going even higher on open terrain and with someone who's had some practice at charging around on the rhino. But that's an estimate, so you've got to take it with a healthy portion of salt. But either way, the woolly rhino is very good at dealing damage and is a creature you ought not to overlook. The Castoroides is not great in terms of DPS. Its saddle is locked away at level 61, and presumably that's because the saddle's ability to act like a smithy to craft items on the go. Because for a level 61 dinosaur, having a DPS of 59 isn't ideal. Its DPS would put it at the top of early game dinosaurs, and if you could get the saddle at level 26, it would be an interesting choice, or rather an interesting dinosaur to look at. But at level 61, the DPS is, it's not great. Like the Parasaur, the Brontosaurus is a base dinosaur, and that means that it has 2 saddles. And they're at 63 and 82. But what about its DPS? Well, it comes in at 63 DPS, which is pretty low, almost very low for a level 82 saddle, but it's not awful either, especially when we're looking at the earlier level saddle. Once again, the Herbivore Curse of Knockback strikes again. It's not going to have 63 DPS in a fight because it's going to knock things very, very, very far away from it. However, that's actually kind of a good thing for the Brontosaur. The Bronto has such a huge hitbox that anything caught in your tail swipe is pretty much going to be launched far enough away that you can very easily chain your tail swipe again and again until it's dead. And finally, we have the Tickle Chicken, the Therizinosaurus. It's weird, it's uncomfortable, but it's very strong. And if we ignore all the dinosaurs that are showing weird inflated DPS, it's because of knockback shenanigans. And we ignore the Megatherium's increased insect damage, then the Therizinosaur is the undisputed king of the herbivores. Its saddle level is 69, nice, but its DPS is 127, which is great. And it's a more mobile Rex that in theory has better health recovery because it can eat veg cakes, but at the cost of 3 DPS versus the Rex, which in my opinion is a winning trade-off on the assumption that you actually have the veg cakes to heal the Theri. I'm sure anyone that has accidentally come across one of these in the wild already knows this, but Therizinosaurs are not to be underestimated and will happily ruin your day with its terrifying ability to deal damage. Oh, some extra final dinosaurs. We have some extra dinosaurs that don't have saddles. I forgot to put them in the middle of the video. I also don't really have a clue on how accessible they are, because while they're saddleless, meaning that you could tame them immediately if you wanted to. However, one of them requires veg cakes, and the other one is found in one of the most dangerous areas in the game. So while they could be tamed and ridden very, very early on, I'm not sure if it's likely, so I'll leave them here. So firstly, the Gigantopithecus, Bigfoot himself, has a really, really solid DPS stat. It's got 98 DPS, which, if we compare, puts it to things like the Thylacoleo and the Diabear, both of which are also found in the Redwoods, weirdly, which makes it a very strong creature. And if you can get it early on, it's a very good choice of tame, as long as you can put up with the monkey butt. And so, finally, for real this time, the last creature we're going to cover in this video is the Ovis. The last on the list, and also the worst. Its DPS is 11, which is bad, but if you get one early, surely it's better than not having a tame at all, right? Well, good luck getting one. Veg cakes are not an easy resource to get early on, and if you've managed to get veg cakes to tame an Ovis, then you've probably got yourself to a situation where you don't really need the Ovis in the first place. Secondly, 11 DPS is almost twice as bad at dealing damage compared to the second worst option, the Gallimimus, I think. And also, Moss Chops exists. Just get one of those if you need a tame early on. The video has been going on for quite a while now, and I'd like to have a short segment here to compare the herbivores in this video to the carnivores from the last video. And I did promise you one last time, but realistically, I think it's probably better if we wait until we have more dinosaurs on the list to compare with, because the more we have, the better we'll be able to see trends within the cohort. However, at a quick glance, I'm impressed by how competitive the herbivores are compared to the carnivores, especially as there seems to be a loose trend where carnivores are more common later on, while herbivores are more accessible in the early game. And that would lead me to assume that herbivores would be weaker in general, but that doesn't seem to be the case. But we'll save the proper analysis for later. Instead, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss future episodes on Ark's Dino DPS. And if you enjoy this video, please give it a like and maybe comment on it down below, as that sort of engagement will really help push the video out there so that we can inform other people about the stuff that we've discussed. And finally, after all of that, I'd like to thank you for watching all the way till the very end. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.